Hi, it's lovely to be back with you. Now, I've been reading a book and I haven't told you about it, but I'm ready to share now, and it's really interesting. It's The Housekeeper's Diary by Wendy Berry, and it's the story of Charles and Diana before their breakup. Now, this book, as you probably know, was banned in Britain, and it was actually published in the USA in New York, 1995, just a few years before Diana's death. And the then Prince Charles did actually instigate some court proceedings, and it was found that any proceeds from the book should actually go into his coffers. And so Wendy Berry fled to the USA, and she did eventually move back to the UK, and no further proceedings ensued because her son actually had leukemia and she was a lot older, and maybe they thought it's all water under the bridge. I mean, by that stage, everybody already knew everything that was already in the book anyway, so I don't know really what happened after that point. Now, you may think, oh, Shauna, this is salacious gossip. What a load of rubbish I'm clicking out. Don't, because you'll be disappointed if you do, because this is really relevant to all the stories we have heard, to all the things that Harry has dragged up, because it gives us a first-hand account into William and Harry's childhood. From when they were little toddlers till for 7 years. 7 years she worked at Highgrove, and she gives us a first-hand account of those two little boys and how they were treated by their mother and how they were treated by her father. Now, look, there's lots of biographies out there, and good ones too, about Charles and Diana. But a lot of them fall into sort of a bias category where you've got sort of Team Charles and then you've got Team Diana. And so you're getting sort of this biased and twisted view often of what went on. But this book really fills in the gaps. And the reason why I think it fills in the gaps is that Wendy Berry comes across as very impartial. She points out the flaws in both characters. She points out Charles's flaws. She points out Diana's flaws. She also points out the really good side of both of them as well. And she seems to have a genuine like for both of them, particularly at the start of the book. Now, as the book goes on, you can see she's a little more favourable towards Charles, and she thinks that the assessment of Charles as a father to William and Harry was unfair. She didn't find him to be a cold and distant and remote father. She experienced something very different from her observation, first-hand observation at Highgrove. So it's fascinating for all those reasons, and there's so many fantastic, juicy little tidbits in this book. So I'm going to share it with you slowly and carefully. I'm going to do a few videos on this because really there is too much in this book to try to share in one video. Now, how did Wendy get the job? Well, her son was actually a footman for Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, and he also got to know Diana and Charles, and they were looking for a new housekeeper for Highgrove because their original housekeeper actually sadly had cancer, and they needed to replace her because she was no longer well enough to work. So James suggested his mother. Now, it's really interesting because she was a teacher, and she had life experience outside the royal fold. So they're bringing in someone who was quite normal because a lot of the footmen and that sort of work their way up into higher positions in royal households, they're not really normal by the end of it all. They've lived in this sort of cosseted sort of royal bubble. And I think it's better to bring outside people in. So here she came. She was like a breath of fresh air. She got the job. She was offered £5,600 a year. She was given a residence near the gatehouse at Highgrove, and they did that up for her. And things all seemed to be going quite swimmingly, especially for the initial years. Now, when she first started there in 1985, she tells a really funny story because Charles and Diana were locked in the throes of passion in their boudoir. And then all of a sudden, two detectives actually stormed their room. Now, what had happened, with guns drawn, by the way, now what had happened was, in the throes of passion, Diana had actually stuck a leg out and managed to knock over a photo frame. And what she didn't realise was there was an emergency button right near that photo frame, and her heel had whacked right on it. Now, you can't hear the alarm from inside the room, so they had no idea. So there they were, passionately lovemaking when these two detectives stormed in. Well, of course, Charles said, "How dare you? What are you doing in here?" And he's trying to defend Diana's modesty. He's trying to pull up the sheet to cover himself. Anyway, they go back out in the hall because they're quite frankly scared of Charles's reaction, and they can see that they're perfectly safe. Charles gets on a bathrobe, comes out in high dudgeon, and then they worked out what happened, that actually Diana had accidentally hit her foot on this emergency button. Now, this caused much mirth all around the staff, all around the household, and it was retold and embellished many, many times. But Wendy Berry says a really interesting thing. She says that it never happened again. And she thinks the fact that it never happened again was the fact that she never actually saw them being passionate after that point, and she didn't even see them sharing the same bedroom. Now, Wendy Berry describes them as extremely civil in those early days. Diana used to refer to Charles as my hubby, and Charles used to refer to her as darling, and they were always very polite and loving in front of the boys, and things were relatively calm. So even though they weren't particularly passionate with each other, they seemed to get along as quite a well-oiled machine, a good partnership. And there was nothing too untoward about anything. There were the occasional flare-ups, but overall, it was pleasant. And they used to come down on a Friday evening, usually alone, but sometimes with guests, and they would leave after lunch on the Sunday. Now, Wendy Berry describes a really fun and happy time with the little boys because Charles used to take them outside a lot. He used to spend pretty much all the Saturday with them out while he was gardening, and they would get all muddy because he would be out there, you know, rain, hail or shine. The boys would go out with him. He would make it fun. He'd be a lot of horseplay, play a lot of games. And he used to also take them for fun tours of the farm. And, you know, she describes them coming in sort of later on in the afternoon, early evening, just covered in mud, taken up by their nanny, who is Barbara Buns, by the way, to have a bath. They'd get their jammies on, and then they would then come down into Diana's sitting room where she would spend a lot of the evening with them. They would have their sort of nursery tea together with her on a tray, and they would watch movies and cuddle up and play games and laugh, and she would read them stories. And Charles would do his own thing, then he would have a bath, and then he would come in and sort of kiss them goodnight and spend a little bit of family time. And then the boys would go off to bed. So it was all, you know, lovely and cozy, and it all went very well, except Charles and Diana would pretty much go their separate ways. Now, it's interesting, she does describe a few negatives about Charles and about Diana. With Charles, it was his very quick temper, and I'll tell you a quote that she actually says in the book. But she said it was sort of, he had sometimes a short fuse, he was testy, he was frustrated, but he wouldn't sort of carry it on. He wouldn't hold a grudge. Whereas with Diana, she would say that she was very compassionate, warm and friendly, and staff would get really, really close to her. But then all of a sudden she'd just turn on you, and she would be very, very cold. And you'd be on the outer and you wouldn't know what you had done wrong. Now, this really didn't happen with Wendy Berry, which is probably why she didn't last beyond the separation. She didn't make any great alignment with either camp, whereas a lot of the staff did. As we know, Michael Fawcett was Team Charles, and, you know, Paul Burrell was Team Diana. Whether he had any choice in that, I don't know. But he was definitely Team Diana in the end. And Wendy Berry didn't really play those games. She didn't play one off against the other. She didn't tittle-tattle, but she used to offer support to staff that were, you know, sort of really upset. When they were on the outer with Diana, they would get really, really upset, and it would really affect them because they would be literally frozen out, and Diana wouldn't talk to them, wouldn't say hello to them, would sort of act like they didn't exist and look right through them. Now, one of the things I realised with reading this book is I always have sympathy when staff write sort of unauthorised biographies of their employers. I feel sorry for the employers because I think, well, they've broken their confidentiality agreements. It's an invasion of privacy. Who would want their dirty laundry out in the public domain? So I usually feel more sorry for the people that have been betrayed. But one thing that is valuable about this book is you can see just how much pressure the staff at Highgrove were. They really were. There was a lot of tension in that house, particularly when all the rows and the scenes and the bickering and the huge crying from Diana happened and everything, because the staff had to pretend they didn't see it or didn't hear it. They had to keep everything smooth and running normally. And particularly in front of William and Harry, they would have to act like they couldn't hear the ruckus. You know, they'd have to keep it all calm at all times. They weren't allowed to tittle-tattle. They didn't tittle-tattle to the media. They were trustworthy, and their real goal, the Stuff were very close, and their real goal was to protect their family, which is their royal family, at Highgrove. Now, this is a quote direct from Wendy Berry. Now, this is after she'd already said about Diana being difficult with staff and making staff upset. She then had to say something that was negative about Charles to be even-handed, and she's very even-handed in this book. She says, as long as he, the then Prince Charles, got his own way, everything went smoothly. And another quote, nobody could honestly say that he was an easy man to live with. And I guess really that could be said about a lot of people, couldn't it? It seemed to be quite a cushy job. They used to be able to have staff drinks pretty much every day. They used to enjoy really lovely meals made by the chefs at Highgrove. And although they had to work really hard when Diana and Charles and the boys were in residence, they also had considerable sort of not time off, because they still had to maintain the residence and make sure it was perfect, because they could unexpectedly arrive. But also, particularly when guests came, it was on for Wendy Berry. I mean, she used to have to prepare all the guest rooms. There was only one of her. She did it all. She had to prepare, of course, all the guest bathrooms. And also, while the guests were there, she would be running up and down the stairs. So when they were having breakfast, she was running up and doing their rooms, tidying the bathrooms, then running back down when they went upstairs after breakfast, you know, to clean their teeth or whatever. She'd be hoovering downstairs, and she'd always be avoiding them seeing her, but she was always hard at work. And it was fascinating to see everything she had to do. And it was also fascinating, in particular, her insight into William and Harry and the way they spent their days with their nanny, Barbara Barnes, the relationship they had with Barbara Barnes, and just how their day was structured. Now, I was fascinated because she did mention about Barbara Barnes that she seemed to have a little bit of an old-fashioned attitude towards the heir and the spare. She said that her primary focus seemed to be on William. She was, of course, she was affectionate and loving towards Harry, but it was obvious to the other staff that her primary focus was William, because he had to be brought up in an exemplary manner because he was the future king. And it made me wonder, here is poor old Prince Charles getting all the blame from Harry for supposedly preferring William, or, you know, making that distinction between heir and spare. And I'm wondering whether it was actually, from a very early age, the nanny and all the staff around them making that distinction, making Harry feel less, even though they mightn't have meant to. And poor old Prince Charles ended up getting the blame. And now King Charles is still getting the blame. So I'm wondering if that's really that fair, because after reading this book, you can see that it was the attitude of more people around them rather than mother and father themselves. So the first few years of her tenure at Highgrove was really pleasant. She said nothing was, you know, too fraught at that stage. And she used to see lots of lovely, cosy family times. And she says often that the then Prince Charles was a fantastic father. He used to lavish the boys with attention on these weekends. Like, he just used to make the most of every single moment. And she says actually a really interesting quote about that. So after describing the then Prince Charles spending hours playing with the boys, as I mentioned before, and taking them for tours of the farm, she said, and I quote, "It used to make us all angry," that's the staff, "that the prince was always thought by the general public to be a remote and difficult father. She paints a very different picture of Charles, dad to two toddlers." So isn't that interesting? And that's a first-hand account. Now, I can't wait to share more from this book because there's so many juicy tidbits in this book. The next video is going to be mainly focusing on chapter 3, which is when Wendy Berry celebrates her first Christmas season at Highgrove. And that is really fascinating. So I hope you will join me. Can't wait to see you then. Bye. Bye.